Imagine being convicted of murder. No DNA, no murder weapon, no forensic evidence placing you at the scene. The case against you rests almost entirely on the testimony of drug addicts whose stories repeatedly changed. 3 trials were needed before a conviction was secured. And years later, CCTV evidence placing you somewhere else emerges, evidence the jury never saw. This is the case of Omar Benguit. And it raises a disturbing question about our justice system. What happens when investigators become convinced they already know who the killer is?
Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. This video explores the case of Omar Benguit as a case study. A brilliant investigative journalist, Brona Monroe, examined this case in depth, painstakingly revisiting the evidence and uncovering new material in 2 programs, a BBC 6-episode series released in 2021 and a BBC Panorama episode broadcast on the 16th of February 2026. Both are linked in the description below, and I strongly recommend watching them if you want to understand the case in greater detail. We do not attempt to replicate that work. Instead, we examine the case for the lessons it offers. As always, our aim is not to determine whether Omar Benguit is guilty or innocent. Rather, we use the case to understand what can happen when investigative pressure, unreliable evidence, and institutional tunnel vision converged within a criminal justice system. The case raises uncomfortable but important questions. How do external pressures influence investigations? What happens when police become convinced of a suspect earlier on? And why are wrongful convictions so difficult to overturn, even when serious doubts later emerge? So let's play detective and follow the evidence. The case begins with a tragedy. On the 12th of July 2002, South Korean student Jong-Ok Shin was walking home from a night out in Bournemouth when she was viciously stabbed. Residents heard screams and came outside. She had been stabbed 3 times in the back. Before she died in hospital, she managed to say that a man had stabbed her and that he was wearing a mask. There was no clear motive, no weapons recovered, and no forensic evidence was left at the scene. As always, we take a moment to remember Jong-Ok Shin, known as Oki, along with their family and friends whose lives were forever changed by the events of that tragic night. Now, let's start by analysing possible external pressure. The stakes surrounding this murder were unusually high. Bournemouth's local economy depends heavily on international students who come to study in England. South Korean students form a significant part of that community. A violent murder of a South Korean student risked serious economic and diplomatic consequences. Local authorities and police were under enormous pressure to solve the case quickly. This answers our first question. How do external pressures influence investigations? In situations like this, investigations can become vulnerable to what criminologists call tunnel vision. Once investigators focus on a suspect, evidence that supports that theory is emphasized, while evidence that contradicts it can be ignored or dismissed where inadvertently or purposively. Now, 6 weeks after Oki's murder, following her arrest for shoplifting in August 2002, a heroin addict, to whom we refer as BB, began giving hints to police about who was responsible for the murder of Oki. Her final claims were that on the night of the murder, she had been driving a car when Omar Benguit and 2 other men flagged her down and got on board her car. She said the men spotted a woman walking alone. Omar allegedly asked her to stop the car, got out, and shortly afterwards, the other 2 men followed. Bibi said she waited about 5 minutes before the men returned running and told her to drive. She claimed Omar removed his shirt, wiped his arms from what she thought was blood, and placed what she believed to be a knife and the shirt into a bag. She then claimed to have dropped Omar off at a crack house, leaving him there while the other 2 men instructed her to drive on, and they disposed of the bag in a river. She also claimed that later on all 3 men raped her. These testimony became the foundation of the prosecution case. However, I say that this was Bibi's final claim because Bibi provided several statements, and her statements contained serious problems. Her description of the attacker changed over time. Initially, she described the attacker as a white male. Later, the description changed to a darker black male. She also originally provided different names for the 3 men and only later gave the final names, which included Omar Benguit, who she identified as the attacker. In her first statement, she said she was not even driving the car. Later, she said she was the driver. There were also contradictions about what car she was driving. Even more importantly, her story conflicted with the only direct account given by the victim herself. Oki said she was attacked by a single masked man. Bibi described 3 men, none masked. There were also credibility concerns. Police documents uncovered by Monroe revealed that Bibi had previously made serious allegations against other people that were later found to be false. Police themselves recorded concerns that these allegations could affect her credibility at trial, yet there is no evidence that the jury were told about those previous false allegations. The police attempted to corroborate Bibi's account. Divers searched the river where she claimed the bag had been thrown. A bag containing clothing was indeed found, but there was no DNA linking the clothes to Omar Benguit. Also, no weapon was found. And there was no forensic evidence placing Omar at the murder scene. CCTV footage from cameras around the murder scene and from locations connected to her account, including the crack house where she claimed that she had dropped Omar off after the attack, were analysed. Attempts were made to identify Bibi's car and trace its movements during the critical period that night. If her account was accurate, it should have been possible to see the vehicle travelling through the area or arriving at the location she described. But the CCTV search produced nothing. There is no CCTV footage showing BBC's car near the murder scene, nor any images of the vehicle or the individuals she claimed were with her in the crack house's vicinity. In other words, the available video evidence failed to support the central elements of her story. Despite all of these weaknesses, the case proceeded. And on the 22nd of August 2002, Benguit was arrested on suspicion of Oki's murder. Another striking feature of the case concerns the two other men in Bibi's account. Neither of them were convicted of any crime relating to the murder. One was deported and never charged. The other, Nick Badamosi, was tried alongside Omar but was acquitted. Yet Bibi's story required their involvement. If the story was true, why did none of the other alleged participants face conviction? The legal process was also unusual. There were 3 trials. The first trial took place in 2003 at Winchester Crown Court. These included charges of the murder ascribed to Omar Benguit, charges of assisting an offender ascribed to Nick Badamosi, and charges of rape ascribed to both. In this first trial, the jury failed to agree on the charge against Benguit for the murder and on Badamosi for assisting an offender, but acquitted Badamosi of rape. A second trial took place in 2004 with the same charges. The jury acquitted Benguit of rape and Badamosi of assisting an offender, but failed to agree on Benguit's murder charge. But in January 2005, at a second retrial concerned only with the murder and featuring only Benguit, Benguit was unanimously convicted and sentenced to imprisonment for life with a minimum term of 20 years. It is not difficult to see how this could have happened. Retrials are intended to correct errors in the justice system, but they also raise important questions about fairness and reliability. Critics often argue that a second trial is not simply a repeat of the first, because both sides, particularly the prosecution, have already learned from the earlier proceedings. One common criticism is that the first trial effectively becomes a rehearsal. The prosecution gets to see the defense's full strategy, including which arguments created doubt, which witnesses appeared weak, and what points seemed to persuade the jury. Armed with that knowledge, prosecutors can refine their approach in a retrial, adjusting their questioning, preparing witnesses more thoroughly, and reshaping the overall narrative of the case. Critics argue that this can create an imbalance, especially where the defense has fewer resources and less opportunity to significantly reassign its case. In addition, in this particular case, the absence of Nick Badamosi from this trial and the absence of certain evidence linked to him, specifically CCTV footage that placed him elsewhere, directly contradicting the main prosecution witness's account, was particularly significant. Without it, there was a clear evidence gap, preventing potential weaknesses in that testimony from being fully exposed. Benguit, who has consistently maintained his innocence, immediately appealed his conviction, but on the 12th of July 2005, exactly 3 years after the murder, his appeal was dismissed. Benguit then filed an application with the Criminal Cases Review Commission in May 2010. These followed BB's appearance on the Jeremy Kyle's show in 2008, during which she gave yet another version of events. At the trial, she had stated that she did not witness the murder, but on the television show, she claimed that she had. In the meantime, a man named Danilo Restivo was facing trial for the murder of Heather Barnett, for which he was later convicted. Barnett was killed in the same neighborhood where Oki lived, and only 4 months after her death. Restivo was also convicted of the murder of an Italian teenager, Elisa Claps, which had occurred in 1993 but came back into focus around the same time following the discovery of her body. There were notably similarities with Oki's murder. Restivo had an apparent obsession with women's hair, and his murders occurred on the 12th day of the month. Oki was killed on the 12th of July, and a clump of hair was found near her body. Restivo also happened to live in the neighborhood where the murder took place and where Oki lived. The CCRC referred the conviction in December 2012, and the Court of Appeal heard the appeal finally in April 2014. The appeal was focused on the following grounds. Ground 1, fresh evidence that inconsistent post-trial accounts further undermine the credibility of BB. Ground 2, fresh evidence that Danilo Restivo may have been responsible for the murder. And ground 3, CCTV undermines the credibility of BB. The Court of Appeal concluded on ground 1, and I quote, "We are not persuaded against that backdrop that further cross-examination of her post-trial account would have altered the verdict. We are in no doubts that the jury reached a verdict consistent with the evidence, and we have heard nothing in either of these grounds to make us doubt the safety of the conviction." On ground 2, the court said that differences between the murders of Elisa Claps and Mrs. Barnett, as compared to that of Miss Shin, do not persuade us that Restivo should be regarded as arguably a candidate for the latter. And ground 3 was dismissed on the basis that the expert analysis of the CCTV footage did not rule out the possibility that the vehicles identified were the same cars in which Benguit was said to have been travelling during the time period in which he could have murdered Miss Shin. This answers our next question. Why are wrongful convictions so difficult to overturn even when serious doubts later emerge? Overall, the court's reasoning appears to reflect a preference for affirming the conviction rather than reassessing the evidential landscape as a whole. It speculated about how the jury might have responded to yet another change in BB's story, focused on the differences between Restivo's other murders rather than possible similarities, effectively adopting the role of a murder scene expert, and downplayed the significance of the CCTV evidence or the absence of it. The unwavering determination of Omar Benguit's family, together with his continued assertion of innocence, 20 years on, despite the fact that he might have been eligible for parole had he admitted responsibility for the murder, and the remarkable work of Monroe led to the discovery of further evidence and to another referral to the Criminal Cases Review Commission in 2021. It emerged that CCTV footage, known to the police from the outset, placed a person very likely to be Omar at a phone box at the time when Bibi claimed he would have been at the crack house. This footage was not disclosed to the defense. Had it been available at trial, it would have directly contradicted Bibi's account of Omar's whereabouts and undermined the central narrative presented to the jury. During this most recent investigation, the CCRC discovered that 135 CCTV tapes from the original police inquiry were missing. The Commission also indicated that the individual captured in the CCTV still appears to resemble Omar Benguit when compared with other images of him identified earlier that same night. Despite these findings, the CCRC has not yet, 5 years later, referred the case to the Court of Appeal. Further questions have since arisen. According to the most recent Panorama programme presented by Monroe in February 2026, original police records showed that the call made from one of those phone boxes were checked by the police. And at the precise time when CCTV captured a man resembling Omar using the phone box, the telephone records show a call being made to a dealer known to supply him. This strongly suggests that Omar was indeed at the phone box at that moment. However, according to Bibi's account, he should have been somewhere entirely different, at the crack house where she said she had dropped him off. In other words, not only there was no evidence corroborating Bibi's account, but there appears to have been evidence directly contradicting it. But there is more. So you may ask yourself, if he wasn't at the crack house, how did the police manage to find 15 plus people who testified against Omar? Several statements were provided by an unusually high number of witnesses who said to have seen Omar at the crack house with blood on him, supporting Bibi's account. And some testified that he had confessed to the killing. Well, Monroe's documentary found that 11 witnesses who had originally supported Bibi's account said police pressured them to change or embellish their statements. 4 of those witnesses have since formally retracted that evidence. 4 others say they were pressured but refused to change their statements. One of those witnesses said the police wanted her to say that Omar was covered in claret, slang for blood. If accurate, this raises extremely serious allegations about the conduct of the investigation. A criminologist interviewed in the BBC Panorama programme went even further, suggesting that the evidence raises the possibility that Omar Benguit may have been framed by the police. This brings us back to the question posed at the beginning. What happens when the police become convinced of a suspect at an early stage? What can follow is a form of tunnel vision, an approach we have seen repeatedly in wrongful conviction cases. Once investigators become certain they have the right person, the investigation may begin to revolve around confirming that belief. In some circumstances, it can go further. Coercive interrogation practices or the manufacturing of evidence can come to be rationalized as a necessary step in the pursuit of a greater good of securing the culprit. Finally, the case also brings to light another important issue: the dilemma faced by prisoners who maintain their innocence when seeking parole. Omar Benguit received a minimum tariff of 20 years. That tariff has now expired. He has spent over 23 years in prison. If he admitted the crime, his exemplary behavior and recovery from addiction would likely make him eligible for release. But Omar confirms this has not happened. Historically, prisoners who refused to admit guilt could struggle to progress through the parole system. Policy reforms following the exoneration of Andrew Malkinson claimed to have addressed this problem. We discussed this issue in this video, but this case confirms that the dilemma remains. For someone who maintains their innocence, admitting guilt in order to secure release presents an impossible moral choice. So, in conclusion, Omar Benguit's case highlights several critical lessons for the justice system. Economic and political pressures can influence the urgency of investigations. Tunnel vision can cause investigators to focus on one suspect too early. Unreliable witness testimony can overshadow objective evidence. Failures to disclose can prevent juries from seeing the full picture. And once a conviction has been secured, appeals are extremely difficult to win, which means that the most important moment in any criminal case is often the very first investigation. Because if the investigation is flawed, correcting those errors later can take decades, and sometimes justice never catches up with the mistake. And that leaves one final question. If the system ever convicts the wrong person, how does that mistake get corrected? Because until that question is answered, cases like this will continue to challenge our confidence in the justice system itself. I hope you have found this analysis engaging and interesting. And if so, please support our mission to humanize the criminal justice system by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to our channel. Join us again as we sit and rise in this unique trial.